everybody to Boozin on a Budget here on Titan TV. It is the whiskey episode. Alright, I can't lie. My drink of choice is bourbon whiskey. But I didn't just come to bourbon whiskey. I got here through experimenting with some whiskey when I was in my younger years, taking some shots. Then I got into scotch, and then I got into wine, really heavy, started tasting and smelling wine, and then I took all those skills over to whiskey. Started out when I was a little bit younger man. I won't say how young, but in high school I used to drink Southern Comfort. Why did I drink Southern Comfort when I was young? Not sure. I just like Southern Comfort, and that's what I got if I could. So that's kind of where it started. After that, I always enjoyed a good shot of whiskey with my beer, but that's all it was. It was just a shot. Shot of Jameson, shot of Bushmills, shot of Jim, shot of Jack. Wherever it was, I wasn't drinking it to sip it or taste it. I was just drinking it, do shots at the bar. Whatever that case may be, that's kind of where I started. I was gravitated towards the whiskey shot. Somewhere right around 2010, I started wanting to go a little bit deeper onto what exactly this whiskey was. So I started drinking bourbon. I just didn't start drinking it. I started looking at the brand names, looking at where it came from, looking to start pick out different flavors and to choose who my favorite bottle was. But I didn't get too deep though. It was still just something that I was kind of knocking back. However, I just started to develop favorites. My favorites in bourbon were Woodford Reserve, Knob Creek, Evan Williams Black Label, Evan Williams Single Barrel. Oh, and I like Jim Beam Black too. That was the early days. Then something happened. When I graduated from college, I was gifted an 18-year-old Scotch. When I tried this Scotch whiskey, my mind was blown. It wasn't anything like the bourbons that I was tasting. It was just this new experience. It was so smooth. It was so good. It was 18 years old. That's the first time that I said, maybe I'm a Scotch person. That whiskey, that 18-year-old Scotch whiskey led me into a whole, several years long obsession with Scotch. My favorites with Scotch whiskey were starting out the Glenlivet, the Glenmorangie, Glenfiddich, kind of a good place to start. Then I got into the Balvenie Doublewood, the Monkey Shoulder. Costco had some really good Scotch selections. In fact, the 18-year that I was gifted was a Costco selection. Lagavulin I was getting into, Oban. Lagavulin and Oban started introducing me to the world of smoky, peaty scotches. I didn't go all the way into that world because, man, Scotch can get super smoky. Some people love it. I was just starting to develop a taste for it. It took me a few years, though, drinking Scotch to do so. During the years that I was drinking and obsessed with Scotch, the times that I would try bourbon, it was too sweet. I still appreciated the flavor of bourbon, but it was just, compared to the Scotch that I was drinking, they were all just too sweet. The thing that started getting me in trouble with Scotch is that this stuff was so smooth. It was mostly 12 years at a minimum. And I found that this high quality Scotch that I was drinking, I could drink a lot of it and not have a bad hangover. So I started drinking quarter of a bottle of Scotch, half a bottle of Scotch, maybe a whole bottle of Scotch sometimes in one sitting, because it was just so smooth, such high quality, and it did not give me a hangover. So I started getting myself in a little bit of trouble with my Scotch. I was drinking too much. So I took a little step back from whiskey at that time, and that's when I started getting obsessed with wine. Man, I started going in on wine. I couldn't learn enough, but what I learned about wine was how to smell it, how to taste it, how to appreciate it, how to look for different characteristics, how to look at where that different wines came from and where they came from, their geography, their terroir, how that played into their flavor profiles. Then came, after that initial surge of wine, my second resurgence into bourbon whiskey. I took all those things that I was learning about wine and I applied them to whiskey tasting, and honestly, I kind of haven't looked back. I then stumbled upon this book, Tasting Whiskey. I'll throw it up in the B-roll. This book really educated me on how whiskey was made, where it came from, all those types of things. If you're looking to educate yourself on whiskey, start to learn a lot more about where it comes from, the process, I would highly recommend this book, Tasting Whiskey, An Insider's Guide to the Unique Pleasures of the World's Finest Spirit. And I agree, whiskey is the world's finest spirit. Go out and get yourself that book if you're interested in learning more. So what is whiskey? Let's move right along to my next segment, binge thinking. We're gonna cover a lot of stuff in binge thinking. First of all though, let's define whiskey. What is whiskey? Alcoholic beverage made from fermented grain mash. So we're gonna get into a little bit more in my guest segment. I'm gonna take you on a tour of Frey Ranch. But whiskey it's a grain originated beverage. Most of the grains are corn, rye, wheat, malted barley. Those are the main grains in whiskey, but whiskey can be made of all different types of grains, and there's some experimental whiskeys coming out. I've heard of different grains coming out, so watch out for those as well. But generally, those are the grains that whiskey is made out of. So those different grains, you then take and add some yeast to it, and it starts fermenting those grains. And the grains that are in your whiskey, those are what is called the mash bill. Let's talk about mash bill. The mash bill is just the specific amount of grains that are in a whiskey. This is the one of the single most important things. People ask, what's the difference between bourbon and whiskey? Well, bourbon is whiskey. However, in order for something to be labeled a bourbon whiskey, it has to have 51% corn in the mash bill. So over half of the mash bill has to be corn. By law, bourbon, it cannot say bourbon on the label unless it meets that characteristic, 51% corn in the mash bill. A rye whiskey, I'm gonna open up this rye whiskey from Frey Ranch. I'm gonna taste this in my later segment, but a rye whiskey has to have 51% rye in the mash bill. After that initial, whether that's corn or rye or malted barley in your scotch is gonna be 100% malted barley. But then you're gonna fill in the rest of the mash bill for bourbon. You're gonna fill that, the corn's gonna take up 51%. Then you're gonna have some rye for the spice. Then you're gonna have some wheat, some malted barley, whatever the case may be. That's one way for distillers and whiskey makers to change the way that their whiskey tastes by messing with their mash bill, putting different amounts of grains in there, experimenting with that. But that's what a mash bill is. The mash bill is the different types of grains and how much goes into making that whiskey. Now there are also different kinds of whiskey. Let's start at the basics. Whiskey can be bourbon whiskey, Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey, Japanese whiskey. These are all grain fermented beverages. Here's a myth. So many people, including myself when I started out, I said, bourbon whiskey has to come from Kentucky. Only bourbon comes from Kentucky. It doesn't come from anywhere else. Technically, bourbon does not have to come from Kentucky. Now, Kentucky has a ton of history. You could say that probably bourbon started in Kentucky, but by law, it does not have to be made in Kentucky to be considered bourbon. Quick rundown of what has to happen lawfully, legally, for it to be considered bourbon. It has to be made in the United States. Aging must take place in new charred oak barrels. Mash bill, 51% corn. The whiskey cannot enter the barrel at higher than 125 proof. Also, your bourbon whiskey cannot have any added colors or flavors. Scotch can add a little bit of color. Their laws allow for that. Bourbon, if it's on the label, no color added. So let's move right along to now. Another thing you're going to see on labels is bottled in bond. This happens to be a bottled in bond rye. Bottled in bond is another thing that people want to put on their label. And there are some laws, believe it or not, there is legality based around this. Bottled in bond has to be at least 4 years old. It has to be 100 proof. It has to be distilled in one season by one distillery, and it has to be overlooked by a government agent. I don't know exactly what that means. It just means that it's probably been under some sort of scrutiny by some type of whiskey agent from the government. The reason bottled in bond started, the history of bottled in bond, is that back in the day they used to make this grain fermented alcohol and they'd slap tobacco in there or this or that or blah 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 whatever, and you didn't really know what you were going to get. So they started this bottled in bond as a way to say the government has actually stepped in and said, we've overseen some of this, we vouch for this whiskey, this is quality whiskey. So really, bottled in bond is just saying that this is good stuff, it falls into these rules, and you know what you're going to get when the label says bottled in bond. Let's talk about proof. A lot of people drink 80 proof whiskey, 90 proof whiskey. You bring like 101 or 105, 107 proof whiskey to somebody and they're like, whoa, that's hot. It's too much alcohol. Sure, higher proof whiskeys are gonna have obviously more alcohol, but what you need to understand is you start getting into whiskey, you become what they call a proof snob. Because essentially any whiskey that's taken out of the barrel and watered down from the 125 is the limit for barreling, but then they take it and they add water. That's why some of the best whiskey comes from Kentucky, because it has some of the best water running over limestone deposits in that Kentucky area. But you take water then and you water it down, you proof it down. So your 80 proof whiskey is whiskey that came out of the barrel at a higher proof, a little stronger, and then they added some water to proof it down. So as you get into it, like myself, I like higher proof whiskeys because there's going to be some more flavor in there. It's more true to what's actually coming out of the barrel. Lower proof whiskey stuff is watered down. That doesn't mean it's bad. That just means they put a little water into that process. So you can find whiskeys that say barrel proof, cask strength, barrel strength. This one here is a single barrel bourbon, cask strength, straight bourbon whiskey. This is actually 116.18 proof. So it's 116 proof. This stuff very, very, very good. This brings me right along to my next piece of information about whiskey. What is a store pick? This happens to be a store pick. You're my boy, Blue! This is a liquor lineup here in Las Vegas. It's a store pick. A store pick means somebody from that liquor store, that bar, that restaurant, they've gone and picked themselves, somebody from that liquor store has gone and sampled different barrels at the distillery and said, you know what? This is my favorite one. This is the one that I want to put my store's name on. So then they say, this is a barrel pick. Generally, they come with one of these goofy stickers. We lovingly call them a tater sticker. There's all kinds of different tater stickers. They're just a bit of marketing, but this is a way to show that it is a store pick. I would highly recommend, if you're a whiskey person and you've not gotten into store picks, I would highly recommend getting some store picks. Go out, you're gonna find at your favorite liquor stores, they've chosen a single barrel and they say, this is the whiskey that represents our taste. We put our name on this. I'm telling you what, my friends, I have yet to have a bad store pick. So that's what a store pick is. I want to talk quickly too, let's just talk about kind of how the bourbon thing has exploded in American culture. Back in the 80s, bourbon kind of took a downfall. The fitness craze was happening in the 80s. People were moving towards clear spirits like vodka. They were starting to worry about calories, things like that. Bourbon whiskey became this, like, that's an old person's drink. That's your grandfather's old bourbon whiskey. It fell out of favor. It was not trendy at all. And so bourbon sales went super, super low. I would say that continued through the 90s and even through the first part of the 2000s. And then in the last 10, 15, maybe even less years, bourbon has exploded in the popularity. It's become this thing that people are hunting for. They're going out looking for certain bottles. The prices have gone up. There's all these different folklore. If you want to look into Pappygate, there's a documentary about the employees at Buffalo Trace had a black market thing going on. We're literally stealing whiskey out of the distillery and selling it to their friends. And it just drove the prices up and made everybody want that whiskey. This is a really good example. This is a Henry McKenna 10-year bottled in bond. You used to be able to find this on the shelf, no problem. $30, $35. Nobody was talking about it. This then won a double gold in the San Francisco Spirits Awards, I believe. After it won that award, everybody started buying this bottle. You can't find this bottle anywhere. You're lucky if you find it. You go out hunting, you're lucky if you see this on the shelf. The only reason I have this, I was talking to the liquor store owner and some of the employees about whiskey, and we tasted some and we were having a good conversation, and the owner brought this from the back and said, here, if you want to buy this, I'll give it to you at retail price, which is about $40. But you can see the stuff, I've seen this for $80, $100, $150. It becomes like this novelty. People are hunting for it. People are looking for it. So this is one of my favorite ones. If you see this on the shelf, you better pick yourself one up. All right, quickly to the last part of binge thinking, I want to talk a little bit about glassware. This right here, it looks like it needs a little deeper cleaning than my dishwasher, but this is what is called a Glencairn. No, not a Karen, Glencairn. This is a whiskey nosing and tasting glass. It It's shaped to gather the odor, the nose of the whiskey here, and then get that going up towards your nose. So this is designed specifically to put your nose in and smell. Really, really popular glassware if you're looking to sip whiskey, smell it, and taste it. Here I have a rocks glass, your typical rocks glass. This one happens to come from a company called Norland. Norland has several different offerings in their glassware for whiskey. There is one that my stepdad has that's really, really good. It kind of tunes some of the ethanol down in the nose, and it's, again, these glasses are designed to expand your experience of whiskey, whether that's nosing or sipping. So if you're really getting into this stuff, I'd highly recommend going out and getting you something, some glassware specifically made for tasting whiskey. Glencairn, it's a good place to start. All right, my friends, I don't have a guest this week. However, I was recently home for Thanksgiving, which is in northern Nevada, which is home to Frey Ranch. I'm rocking my Frey Ranch hat. I got my Frey Ranch rye. I got my 100% corn. We're talking about the grains used in making whiskey. This whiskey here has 100% corn in the mash bill. I was recently out at the distillery in Fallon, Nevada, and I have some video of that. I'm going to talk you through all that. So please join me as I go on this tour of Frey Ranch Distillery.
All right, come with me on a tour of Frey Ranch. Frey Ranch is located in Fallon, Nevada. It is an estate distillery within a 165-year-old 1,500-acre family farm. We went on Small Business Saturday, and our tastings were free. What does it mean to be an estate distillery? Well, it means that the complete process to make their spirits occurs on the ranch. They grow all the grains, malt their own barley, ferment, distill, barrel, and age their whiskey all on the ranch. Hence the term, from grains to glass. Here you can see we are in their fermenting room. They're fermenting their rye when we were visiting there, and each one of these fermenters are in different stages of fermenting. This one here that I'm approaching now is in its first day. As you can see, it is the most active. Also, one of the main components of Frey Ranch is that they use all of the byproducts of making their whiskey. You can see here some of the byproducts coming out of the fermenting room and being taken to their local dairy where they're fed to happy cows. You can see here that they run their stuff through 2 column stills, and it then goes to a pot still. This pot still is something that was made for them specifically from a brand in Kentucky. These copper pot stills are one traditional way of distilling spirits. The copper is said to strip unwanted flavors out of there. Also, as I said before, nothing goes unused. The spent mash bill grains go to the dairy farmer, who then returns the manure to Frey Ranch, and they use that to fertilize their fields. They also irrigate their fields with water that is left over from their whiskey making process, and it helps to raise the salinity levels in the soil. They also use water from their own pond as a cooling mechanism in their whiskey making. Now you can see we're stepping into the rick house here. Look at all those barrels of whiskey just sitting there aging. The darker the barrel, the older it is. You can see here some of that whiskey kind of, as it absorbs into the wood, it starts leaking out a little bit. These rick houses don't have any heating or air conditioning. They're just subdued to the elements, and that is one of the natural processes of aging your whiskey. That was it for my tour of Frey Ranch. You can see here the grounds here. They have a bunch of really cool old John Deere tractors. If you're in the northern Nevada area, go check out Frey Ranch.
All right, let's get to my favorite part of the show. I get to open up a bottle of rye whiskey. Rye whiskey, rye whiskey. As we covered before, rye whiskey is if it's going to be called rye, it has to have at least 51% rye in the mash bill. Rye is known for being spicier. It has a little bite. If you're new to whiskey, I maybe wouldn't start with rye. Just go ahead and start with your bourbons first. But I do love me a little bite, a little bit of strength. I want my whiskey to pop me in the mouth a little bit. So let's get into this rye whiskey from Frey Ranch. This one's aged 6 years. It is a bottled in bond expression. We covered that earlier. So it is 100 proof. Well, this is a 100% rye in the mash bill. No other grains. 100% winter, slow grown winter rye. I'm actually pretty stoked. I would highly recommend the straight bourbon whiskey from Frey Ranch. It's killer. Killer stuff. I've actually, well, I was going to say I've never had the rye, but I did taste the rye on the distillery tour, but I haven't actually sat at home and tasted the rye, so I'm actually pretty stoked. I find Frey Ranch, of course I'm biased, I'm from Nevada. There's a lot of hype about Frey Ranch. How can we not love, Frey Ranch? They're nationally known now, doing things from my little part of the world, northern Nevada. So let's check it out. We're gonna taste it. One thing we like to do is do the pop. Let's do that pop. Pop. Ooh. Oh. Look at the color already. You can see it's nice and dark up against that white. Swish, 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 just like we do with the wine. We're gonna swish it around a little bit, get some oxygen to it, let it open up a little bit. We're also going to swish, swish, swish around so that it starts to bring those aromas up into the glass. Oh man, maple syrup, like charred marshmallow. There's some sweetness there, some nice whiskey sweetness. It tastes a little bit like graham cracker or it smells a little bit like graham cracker crust. A little spearmint. Rye is known for having a little bit of a mint quality, sometimes some cinnamon as well. God, this just tastes like a sweet toast, or it smells like a sweet toasty marshmallow with some grains too. Taste that cinnamon. If sipping whiskey intimidates you, start with a lower proof. Start with an 80 proof. Start with a wheated whiskey, more wheat in the mash bill. Don't start with a 100 proof rye, but start sipping it. Add a couple drops of water to open it up. I mean, literally a couple drops, like drop, drop. Drop a nice pure ice cube into your whiskey. There's no shame in some of that game. I like to drink my stuff neat, but I have been sipping it for a while, and I've developed my palate to be able to do that. It does have a real similar grain note on the nose that I find in their straight bourbon whiskey. Frey Ranch bottled in bond rye, very smooth. This is my drink of the week. I actually thought it might have a little bit more kick, but man, that's smooth and drinkable. I'd say maybe not quite as sweet, not quite as fruity as their Frey Ranch straight bourbon, but very good, very good. My last segment is pairs with. Now, for whiskey, I know people pair sometimes their whiskey with some chocolate. Really popular to pair your whiskey with a cigar. We'll go a little different route today. I'm going to talk about pairs with an app. This app is called Distiller. I use this app a ton. This is where I can go pop in a whiskey, get reviews, get more information, get user reviews, get expert reviews, read articles. There's a million different things in this app, Distiller. I use this a lot just to get an idea about what other people are saying about this whiskey. What does it stack up? It gives me flavor notes. I can keep a log of some of the whiskeys that I've tasted in here. It's just a great way to get more information. If you're starting to get into whiskey, you want to get the Distiller app. It's just a great resource on your whiskey journey. Because I like the tech, right? There's a wine app that we'll talk about in the wine episode. I talked about Untapped, the beer app. There's all sorts of stuff, man. I love Total Wine's app just because I use that app quite a bit to establish a baseline for what a price point might be on beer, wine, whiskey, tequila, vodka, rum, whatever it may be. Total Wine is going to show you probably one of the most cheap prices that you're going to find it, given they're a big box retailer. I use the Total Wine app just to establish, again, a baseline of cost to see, just where some of these things and some of their other competitors may be sitting price point wise. So if you're getting into this booze stuff, if you're with me on this booze journey, lean on some of the tech. There are all kinds of different apps. Obviously, Google everything for your answers. If you have questions, Google everything. But I really find that a lot of these apps are really helpful in me as I'm learning and exploring wines, whiskeys, and other beverages. I love bourbon so much that this was just the general whiskey episode. I'll probably do a whole bourbon episode. I'll do a Scotch episode. Maybe I'll lump everything else, the Irish, the Canadian, the Japanese, into another episode. But suffice it to say, there are all kinds of different styles of whiskey that you should familiarize yourself with. I'm going to warn you though, once you go down the whiskey rabbit hole, you may not come back for a while. Once you acclimate your palate to sipping whiskey, you're going to find just so many layers of flavor, so many different experiences. And we haven't even talked about cocktails yet. You can make all kinds of wonderful, wonderful cocktails with bourbon and whiskey and different things like that. So I would highly recommend start sipping some whiskey. Start with the lower proof stuff, 80 to 90 proof to start. Maybe start with a wheat whiskey. Just start sipping it, start tasting it, start smelling it, start appreciating it, and you're going to be well on your way to being a bourbon addict like myself. All right, my friends, thank you so much for stopping by and hanging out, having a drink with me here on Boozin' on a Budget on Titan TV. The next episode, I don't know what the next episode is. I'm going to be traveling for Christmas. We might just do a fun one where anything goes. Whatever the case may be, we're going to talk about educating ourselves, learning more about this process, learning how to find the best stuff for the best prices. That's what we do on Boozin' on a Budget. Once again, thank you guys so much for hanging out. We'll see you next time.